my name is Sejal Thomas, and for my timeline project, I explored the history of immigration in the United States from 1790 to the present. My timeline focuses on how immigration and citizenship policies have changed over time and how these policies have affected different racial and ethnic communities. For this presentation, I chose one event from each of the 5 time periods that I think represents an important change or theme in U.S. immigration history. The first event I chose is the Naturalization Act of 1790, which was the first federal law to establish rules for becoming a naturalized U.S. citizen. The law limited naturalization to free white people, meaning that many racial groups were excluded from citizenship from the very beginning of the country's history. I chose this event because I think it's important to understand where American citizenship policy started. What stood out to me was that race wasn't something that was introduced into immigration policy later on. It was already part of the country's first naturalization law. I think this event helps explain many of the racial restrictions that appear throughout the rest of U.S. immigration history. For the second time period, I chose the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This law suspended the immigration of Chinese laborers and was the first major federal immigration law to restrict immigration based on nationality. It particularly affected Chinese workers and families, including families that were separated or unable to reunite in the United States. I chose this event because it shows how racial prejudice and economic concerns could directly influence immigration policy. Chinese workers were often blamed for economic competition, and anti-Chinese attitudes became connected to federal immigration restrictions. I think it's important because it established a precedent for the government restricting entire groups of people based on their nationality and race. For the third time period, I chose Executive Order 9066, which President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed in 1942 during World War II. The order allowed the military to establish exclusion zones and ultimately led to the forced removal and incarceration of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, many of whom were American citizens. I chose this event because I think it demonstrates the connection between immigration, race, national security, and civil rights. Even though many of the people affected were citizens, their Japanese ancestry caused them to be treated as potential threats during the war. I think this is especially important to immigration history because it shows how fear during a national crisis can contribute to racial discrimination and the loss of constitutional rights. For the fourth time period, I chose the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act. This law ended the national origins quota system that had favored immigration from certain European countries. Instead, the new system placed greater emphasis on things like family reunification and skilled workers, which expanded immigration opportunities for people from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and other parts of the world. I chose this event because I see it as one of the biggest turning points in my entire timeline. A lot of my earlier events involved the government restricting people based on race or nationality, while this law moved immigration policy away from that system. I also think it's important that it happened during the civil rights era because it shows how changing attitudes about racial equality were also influencing immigration policy. For the final time period, I chose the creation of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, in 2012. DACA provided certain undocumented immigrants who came to the United States as children with temporary protection from deportation and the ability to legally work in the country. However, it did not give recipients a pathway to citizenship. I chose DACA because it brings a lot of the issues from earlier parts of my timeline into the modern immigration debate. It raises questions about citizenship, legal status, opportunity, and what it means to be American, especially for people who have spent most of their lives in the United States. I think DACA is important to understanding immigration history because it shows that many of these debates are still unresolved today. Overall, one of the biggest things I learned from creating this timeline is that U.S. immigration history isn't simply a progression from restrictive policies to more accepting ones. Instead, it seems to go back and forth depending on the political, economic, and social conditions of each time period. One major pattern I noticed was how often race and nationality influenced who was considered deserving of citizenship or entry into the United States. From the Naturalization Act limiting citizenship based on race, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II, racial attitudes repeatedly influenced government policy. At the same time, events like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 and DACA show efforts to expand opportunities or protections for immigrant communities. The biggest takeaway I had from this project is that immigration policy isn't only about determining who can enter the country. It's also connected to larger questions about race, citizenship, equality, national identity, economics, and social justice. Looking at all 25 events together made it much easier for me to see how those issues have continued to shape immigration debates throughout U.S. history. Thank you.